and welcome. Well can the world's most powerful religious institution stand up to the challenge of the terrible scandal facing it? The release of a series of scathing reports last year detailing sexual abuse within the Catholic Church in Ireland has led to a flood of victims coming forward. Those now telling their stories are not only from Ireland but across Europe too. With questions about a possible church cover-up growing, the scandal could touch Pope Benedict himself. Accusations centre on the pontiff's previous role as Archbishop of Munich, when he may have been aware that a priest being treated for paedophilia was reassigned to a new post. That same priest was later convicted of molesting boys in another parish. The Pope has already offered an apology to the faithful in Ireland regarding the sexual abuse, but many say it's not enough. As anger and disappointment rise among the Church's faithful this Easter weekend, we ask, how can the Church repair the damage caused by the sexual abuse scandal? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or an email, and we'll also welcome your phone calls onto the show. Joining me now from New York is Dr. Bill Donohue, President and CEO of the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights, an organization that fights anti-Catholic bias and defends the right of Catholics to participate in American public life. Dr. Donohue's most recent book is Secular Sabotage: How Liberals Are Destroying Religion and Culture in America. From St. Louis, Missouri, we have David Closey, the National Director of SNAP, the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. In 2002, Mr. Closey was one of 4 survivors who addressed America's Conference of Catholic Bishops on the issue of sexual abuse. Gentlemen, I welcome you both to the show. And Dr. Donohue, if I could start with you there in New York, sir, why are you so convinced that the recent allegations against members of the Catholic Church are unjustified?
Well, they're unjustified for several reasons. Number one, why is it that the New York Times has decided, with all of its debt, to use its resources to go back 50 and 60 years about one institution? They have no new news here. I'm not opposed to the New York Times investigating any dirt in my church. I just want to know, why is it that the Protestants and the Muslims and the Jews, as well as secular institutions like the public schools, where the estimated abuse record is something like 100 times greater than anything you'll find in the Catholic Church, why did they selectively cherry pick the Catholic Church and leave everybody else alone? I think that's a very interesting question.
Well, perhaps so. Right, so while the focus is on the Catholic Church, I wonder, given the responsibility of the Pope, what role do you think he should play in bringing an end to this scandal, to wrap this thing up once and for all? I mean, should he turn priests over, those accused, over to the secular civilian courts, for example?
He should do exactly what state law requires, which is what they've authorized people to do for a very long time. And quite frankly, this scandal has been long over. I mean, what we're talking about here is back in the 50s and the 60s. Quite frankly, if you take a look at the timeline, most of these cases took place between the mid-60s and the mid-80s. In fact, the latest report about this problem shows that over 40,000 priests in the United States, there were exactly six allegations, I don't know if any of them are true, against priests in 2008 and 2009. So what I'm saying is that there are people who have a vested interest, ideologically and financially, to try and go back in time and say, look, the problem is still alive. No, this is a fiction.
Well, presumably some of those living with what happened in the cases where there was abuse are looking for resolution. And we have David Closey joining us from St. Louis, Missouri. Sir, I'm glad you could join us too. Now, you've been a victim of the kind of sexual abuse that some of the members of the Catholic Church are accused of, and I know you've defended others who say they've also been abused. I wonder, what is it that Pope Benedict could say this Easter that might bring some kind of relief or sense of transparency to this issue for you?
Well, frankly, there's nothing the Pope can say that'll make a difference. Action protects kids, not words. And there have been plenty of words from the Vatican, but there has been no decisive global action to protect kids. It's important to point out that the last global step that has been taken by the church hierarchy about clergy sex abuse was in 2001, and that step was an edict to bishops encouraging them to keep this secret. The problem is very much going on. And even if let's assume Bill Donohue is right that the Catholic bishops in America have done a good job. We don't think so. But even if that's true, that is 4% of the world's Catholics. For the other 96% of the world's Catholics, the Pope has done literally nothing to make the church safer for children today.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Closey, what do you make of the Vatican Tribunal's legal strategy? Just recently announced that the Pope has diplomatic immunity. I wonder, to what extent is do you feel he's perhaps effectively abandoning the bishops who could be called to testify?
Well, it's a very predictable but a very sad legal maneuver. You know, if the Pope has nothing to hide, then he should welcome a court battle and a chance to prove that, in fact, he handles these cases well. But he's doing exactly what bishops across the world do, which is to exploit every legal technicality, every loophole, every maneuver to keep them from having to face the tough questions in open court about these serial predator priests and about the complicit bishops who continue to this day covering up those crimes.
Well, Dr. Donoghue, I wonder, you know, considering that the Vatican Tribunal has said there's nothing in canonical doctrine that stops priests from reporting abuse, why there hasn't been perhaps a little more sense of them being more forthcoming in trying to deal with these issues, especially in light of the memos saying that perhaps this should be kept a little more quiet?
Listen, every time you have an internal investigation, whether it's at the New York Times or in the Catholic Church, it's never shown on C-SPAN. All right? I mean, I love it when the New York Times says they had a secret discussion. Well, the New York Times had an editorial meeting this morning. I guarantee you it was secret. They wouldn't allow you in. They wouldn't allow me in. So let's stop at the nonsense that the Catholic Church is, you know, what are they, underground, below the sea or something, meeting so nobody can hear them? What they're simply saying is this: before you go ahead and you make an accusation and get somebody arrested, you have to find out if it's true. Quite frankly, if somebody were to call right now and say that David Cloesi is a child abuser, I'm sure that he would want to make certain that his civil liberties were protected and that he would be presumed innocent because maybe the charge is totally false, and I'm sure it was. That's just a hypothetical. My point is this: why is it that priests in this country, particularly that I can't speak about elsewhere, I know priests in this country feel that they're under siege because they have no rights. There's a presumption of guilt and not innocence, and that's largely the result of the kind of dirty tactics that a lot of groups, including David's, have been pulling.
If I may,
Dr.
Riz,
Donoghue, why are they not more forthcoming in answering? I'll get to you in just a second, David Cloesi, but I just wonder, with Mr. Donoghue, why, Dr. Donoghue, why isn't it that there has been more open discussion from the Church? It seems for a lot of people the Church is very closed off. What we're talking about here, unlike the New York Times, which has a closed-door meeting, here we've got issues of sexual abuse allegations, and this is something that people want to address and deal with obviously in a more open way. You know,
this is so surreal. You're not talking to me about a single case in 2010, are you? Not a single case are you talking to me about.
Well,
we're talking about what happened 50 and 60 years ago, all right? That makes a pretty big difference.
There's obviously still a need for resolution, though, so obviously there's a number of people who feel there's still an issue that needs to be resolved.
Well, if you had 6 accusations last year, that's 0.00008. I would put up the Catholic Church's record today on this question, compare it to any group of Jews, Muslims, Protestants, and certainly the public school industry in the United States. Who has a better record? The Catholic Church's record is #1.
Well, David Cloesi, sorry I interrupted you. You were going to make a point as well.
Well, I just want to say, Bill does what Catholic bishops always do. They want to focus on the individual predator priest. The sad fact is what makes the Church different is the widely documented continuing cover-up of bishops. When a predator is caught in other institutions, they are simply turned over to the police sooner and they have fewer victims. You brought up the Vatican policy about keeping it secret. Frankly, the Vatican didn't even need to put that in a memo because historically for decades, bishops have tried to keep these cases out of the public limelight, and they still do. So, Mr. Donoghue's point about how few allegations there happen to be this year in the United States is irrelevant because the figures he's citing are from a self-survey of the bishops themselves, the very same men who for decades ignored and concealed child sex crimes. So how can we possibly put any stock, any credibility in their own self-survey?
Well, let me just
let's bring in a viewer question here. We've got Dr. Donoghue, just quickly, so we've got Mohammed in Minnesota with a question. Let's get some viewer questions in as we do on this show. Go ahead, Mohammed.
My question is, the guy in New York, I don't remember his name. I think his name is Don. He keeps saying why the New York Times didn't investigate the Muslim community and the Muslim imams. We never had a case in the Muslim community or Muslim imams there when the imams sexually abused their kids or their students. But we have at least 200, 300 cases for the last 20 years in the Catholic or the Christian community. So how come you keep saying the Muslim community, they have to investigate? The only thing we see in the news is the terrorists and things like that, but we never had a case.
I think
that's the Muslim people.
Mm-hmm. I think, Mohammed, that Dr. Donahue was just using Islam and other religions as an example here. But Dr. Donahue, I was going to ask you, while the Catholic Church has tied the cases to many minors, I know you describe it as a homosexual crisis and not paedophilia. You claim that 80% of the victims are male, past puberty, and that the molesters are gay. But aren't you essentially treading a very fine line with that kind of statement and essentially in danger of labeling the victims?
No. No, I'm not, and I'm going to repeat it again. This is not an opinion. This is taken from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. They found out when they reviewed this situation in the church from 1950 to 2002 that 81% of the victims were male and that 75%, 3 out of every 4, were post-pubescent. In other words, it's gays, it's homosexuals who have done this wreckage to the Catholic Church. That's the figures, and I am not going to sit here and lie about it or even pretend that it's contentious. It happens to be a matter of record, but most of the problem is the result of homosexuality.
Accepting those numbers, Dr. Donahue, what about the issue of them being people in the ward of seniors who are supposed to be responsible for their welfare and supposed to be basically guardians of their interests?
Well, listen, as far as I'm concerned, had they taken the advice of people of more conservative bent like me, we would have taken care of these bums a long time ago. I'd put them in prison. Instead, they listened to the liberals who said, oh, we can fix these people. We can bring them to the psychiatrist. We can give them therapy. That's what's wrong with the Catholic Church. They should have just simply thrown the book at these guys a long time ago.
We're going to take a very short break here, but continue more of our discussion in just a moment. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the most recent sexual abuse scandal to rock the Catholic Church in Europe. With me are Dr. Bill Donahue, President and CEO of the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights, and David Closey, the National Director of SNAP, the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. David Closey, you heard the arguments put forward there by Dr. Bill Donahue. One thing I want you to address as you respond to some of those is the unprecedented letter of apology that was written by Pope Benedict XVI to Ireland. He said, to the offenders, he said, "You betrayed the trust that was placed in you by innocent young people, and you must answer for it before Almighty God, before properly constituted tribunals." What type of justice do you think he's talking about, or what particular justice would you like to see?
Well, certainly there needs to be active involvement of the criminal justice system. These men are criminals, and despite their lofty status as priests, they have to be brought before courts of law, and there have to be more investigations like the one sponsored by the Irish government that helped uncover all these terrible, terrible cover-ups. We do think it's crucial. No institution can protect itself, so we think it's crucial that the secular authorities step in and reform some of these archaic laws so that victims can expose their predators in court and protect kids. On this issue of the gays, though, let me just point out that we're a support group, and in SNAP, fully half of our members are girls who were molested by priests. So the notion that somehow predators have a sexual orientation issue is irrelevant. You know, every child sex crime, whether perpetrated by a man or woman against a child of a boy or girl, it doesn't matter. It's all wrong, and to pretend that somehow gay people or straight people contribute more to this crisis is just silly.
No, the actual statistics.
And David Closey, I want to put you, Sir, Dr. Donahue, just wait a second, sir. Dr. Donahue, just 1 second, sir. I just want to put something else to David Closey. It was a viewer we had who wrote in, who also was a victim of sex abuse and has talked about her story. Rosemary wrote in saying, "I'm a victim too, and these groups provide witness expertise and then get major payoffs. It's a racket. I dropped out of the 2004 Pittsburgh case because they weren't addressing abuse by nuns, only priests. Silent victims get nothing, but you can be sure the lawyers and their groups get their money. And I wonder, David Closey, in trying to get these issues addressed, how easy is it to lose confidence in the ability to actually achieve something? And I guess I wonder, why hasn't the issue of abuse in other quarters, allegations of abuse by nuns, for example, been addressed as well more openly?
Well, we certainly have hundreds of people in SNAP who were abused by nuns. We have people abused by bishops, by rabbis, by Protestant ministers, by seminarians. And I would encourage the Muslim man who called in, if he knows about abuse in the Muslim community, to please come forward. This woman is absolutely right. The abuse by female predators gets far less attention than it should. And in fact, most victims never sue. The ones who do decide to try and sue, most of them, the overwhelming majority of cases, are frozen out by these archaic statutes of limitations which Catholic bishops support and Catholic bishops exploit. I mean, the bottom line is that while the church, no institution can police itself, as I said, but while the church tries to continue to handle these things internally, we as a society, to protect kids, have to involve the criminal and civil justice systems and the independent professionals in law enforcement who have the expertise and the objectivity to pursue these crimes and get these men off the streets, as well as the men who cover up these crimes, including the bishops.
Dr. Donoghue, actually, in your recently, your group took out an ad in the New York Times where you said that basically people were going for the Vatican jugular. You expressed that at the beginning of the show, that you felt there was an agenda. Now, in your comments in the New York Times, you state that you believe critics are out to weaken the morale of the church. Why is that?
Well, there's no question about it. The New York Times likes abortion. The New York Times likes women's ordination. The New York Times likes gay marriage, and the Catholic Church rejects all three. I mean, anybody in the United States who's a fair-minded person will tell you that there's a culture war going on here. And obviously, if you can weaken the moral authority of the Catholic Church, you have gone a long way. I'm very proud of that ad that I wrote. It's really begun to change the tenor of debate, because now, as you see, Cardinal Levada has now struck, and the Catholic Church is taking the offensive, not just against the New York Times, but against all kinds of reporters. Reuters reporting, for example, now that Ratzinger knew about the case of Father Murphy in Wisconsin. Even the New York Times says he didn't even know about it. And, you know, we have serious questions. There was a judge in charge of that Father Murphy case, the horrendous one with the 200 deaf kids out of the 1950s. That judge was Father Thomas Brundage. He was the judge who presided over the Murphy trial between 96 and 98. We're wondering now, why did Laurie Goodstein, who wrote the piece in the New York Times about this story, never even bothered to call this man up and ask him, did Ratzinger, namely the Pope today, know anything about the Murphy case? I think I know why she didn't, because it might blow her story.
Okay, Dr. Donoghue, an email to you, if I may, sir, that came in from a viewer by the name of Intiyaj Far, who says, I think they should allow married people to be priests or even pope. Now, that's also an issue that's divided the Christian faith as well, isn't it? The issue of marriage or sort of sanctified relationships in of those types.
That's right. I'm so glad that he mentioned that, because what is the subtext? What is the predicate? It makes my point. If you get rid of celibacy, you'll get rid of the gays, because it'll be mostly married men. And when you get rid of the gays, you'll get rid of most of the problems, since they're the ones who cause most of it. I happen to think that's a very good logic.
David Closey, I wonder what gives you a sense of hope that this issue might be resolved. I mean, what makes you, in terms of like the U.S. Church, the U.S. churches, for example, said abuses have fallen by more than 30%. I wonder if that gives you some hope, and perhaps that the issue is being discussed more openly. Do you see some kind of resolution sometime in the future?
Well, what gives me hope is the courage of men and women who have been suffering in pain for so long, picking up the phone, calling our group, calling a therapist, calling police, and getting help. We can't change what the Catholic hierarchy does, but we can help console people who have been suffering for so long. I also, frankly, take a lot of hope from the fact that Catholic employees, current and former, Catholic Church members, are much more skeptical these days of what bishops are telling them about abuse, and they're more willing to contact independent sources of help, like our support group, and say, hey, we've heard about this priest, do you know anything about him? Change usually comes, frankly, from the bottom up. And finally, we're encouraged by lawmakers who are taking a look at some of these old laws and saying, yes, we have to change things and make it a little bit more child-friendly and less predator-friendly.
And I wonder, Mr. Closey, what do you think this has done to the faithful of the Catholic Church? How much of a real crisis is this for the Catholic Church to be this being discussed right now and involving even statements from the Pope?
Well, I think ultimately, I know in the short term, it's very, very disturbing to many Catholics, and we understand that. In the long term, of course, though, this kind of public discussion is very, very healthy. Abuse thrives in secrecy. Cover-up can only happen in secrecy. And for so long, this subject has been taboo in the Church, and it still is in many corners of the world. So as painful as these disclosures are, because they do, in fact, involve the Pope himself, ultimately, this is a very positive thing for the Church and for the rest of society. I mean, we have seen other people and other institutions who were molested encouraged by the bravery of Catholic survivors, and they're beginning to start organizations like SNAP of their own and beginning to report the crimes, and that's just healthy for everybody involved.
Dr. Donoghue, we've got about 20 seconds left, sir. And if I can ask you in a line, do you see resolution to this? Do you think that this will be dealt with finally to a point where it doesn't have to be discussed anymore?
Oh, I don't know about that, as long as the New York Times may want to go back 100 years and find out there's another abuse, you know. So if people who hate the Catholic Church will continue with this. But to the extent that it's harder for practicing homosexuals to get into the priesthood, the problem will resolve itself because they're the ones who caused it in the first place.
Okay. Well, thank you, sir, for joining us, Dr. Donoghue and David Closey as well. Now, remember, you, our viewers, can follow the show on Facebook and see what we're up to there. You can give us your feedback on the show and post your questions and comments as well as catch previous segments. You can also send show suggestions and questions to riz@aljazeera.net. That's it from me and the team here in London and in DC. Hope to see you next time. Goodbye.